This is the second video in the Awakening to Oneness series. This one's called The Illusion of the Separate Self. Last week we did video number 1, which was the introduction to non-duality. In this video, we're going to talk about how we came to be a separate self. Where did that come from? We always have been one with God, but our experience is that we are a separate self, separate from our world, separate from each other. Where did the experience of duality come from? I'll be talking about that and a lot more, so stay tuned. Hi, welcome to the channel. My name is Michael Doyle. The title of this video is The Illusion of a Separate Self. And this illusion is the biggest misconception at the heart of the human experience. And it gives rise to the experience of duality, where we think of ourselves as separate from everybody else. There's me, and then there's you and everybody else, and we're all separate. It gives rise to other duality experiences such as hot and cold, up and down, birth and death, and human and divine. When we experience ourselves as separate, we tend to have a deep sense of longing and feel disconnected, and we search for some kind of connection. We live in a false reality that's based on fear and attachment to the ego. Our relationships, we see them as a means to getting something. We look for other people to meet our imagined needs instead of recognizing the unity that is at the heart of all of our shared experience. We live in fear of loss, attack, and death because we see ourselves as this tiny little cog in a great big world, and we feel vulnerable and powerless to a large extent. And we create all these hierarchies within the human experience, that some people are better than us and worth more than what we are, and we compare ourselves to other people. And this all reinforces the illusion that some people are better than we are, and that's all based on the ego. The ego is the one who makes those calls and those decisions. We tend to look outside of ourselves to material possessions and to the government and to other people and to companies and bosses to help us get our needs met. What we don't realize at this level, of course, is that everything we need is already within us. So the separate self is just a false belief that needs to be undone. And when it dissolves, we recognize the truth of our being, which is that we have always been and still are one with God. And that, of course, changes our entire experience of being in this third-dimensional illusionary reality. So where did this come from? Here we were sitting comfortably at one with God. We still are, but where did this illusion that we became a separate self come from? I'm going to offer you two versions, and keep in mind that these are just analogies. There's no way we could, with our tiny human brains, that we could comprehend what actually happened, but there are two versions that I'm going to offer. There are probably a lot more, but these are some common ones. So the first comes from A Course in Miracles, and it says that the birth of the illusion that we were separate from God was a tiny mad idea that the Son of God contemplated. I wonder what it would be like to be separate from God. Well, first of all, I had trouble with this term Son of God, because if we haven't split from God yet, then how can there be two, a Son and God? After doing a little bit of research, I came across the following analogy. We have the sun, and the sun has rays. They're not separate, but we use the two terms to distinguish between the two. So that's what's happening here, is The Son of God is one, but we're using the term Son to distinguish the part of God that said, I wonder what it would be like to separate from God. Of course, it was immediately recognized as completely impossible, but it gave birth to the illusion that it could actually happen. And from there, the illusion began to fragment itself into smaller and smaller dispersed pieces until it came all the way down to each individual human with the belief that we are a separate self. Another version is that God wanted to contemplate itself, but because it was so vast and it was all that is, how could it possibly contemplate itself? It would be like asking you, for example, take a look at your face right now. You couldn't do it, right? Unless you created something that you could hold in your hand that would reflect your face back to you, called a mirror. And the image in the mirror is not your face, but it's an illusion. And so that's what God had to do. If it wanted to contemplate itself, it would need to create something outside of itself, like an illusion, in order to reflect back. So the first thing that God did was created the Elohim. And we sometimes call them the creator gods because they're the ones who actually created everything else. They were imbued with the ability to create, as we all are, and so they created the rest of reality. We don't know how many Elohim there actually were. When I first learned about them decades ago, I was taught that there were 9, and recently I heard a teacher say that there were 13. The number's not important. What's important is to realize that everything that we attribute, whether it be the planets, extraterrestrials, human beings, animals, wars, famine, weather, disasters, whatever, they were all created by the Elohim. And they fragmented down into individuals, like ourselves, like alien individuals. One way of looking at it is, imagine that God was like a bank of fireworks, where we have these cannons that have the ability to shoot out a ball of energy, and then once it hits a certain height in the sky, it bursts out. Well, that's kind of like what happened. God sent out through these cannons the Elohim, and from there, the Elohim branched out into all kinds of different illusionary realities and created everything we know and unknown. Because there's also subatomic and various dimensions within the illusion that the various Elohim were responsible for. Each part of the fragment, or each fragmented piece within the illusion, still has the memory embedded in it of its truth, of its reality, of still being connected to God. One final point that's worth mentioning, and this may blow some of your minds, is, as the Course says, this tiny mad idea and the creation of the illusion was over in a flash, if you can imagine that. So everything that we understand as creation happened in a flash. It's been over forever. We are just playing out everything that was already created. Creation is over. Wrap your head around that. I'll be talking more about that in other videos and breaking that down a lot more. What are some of the ways that the separate self manifests in our illusionary reality? And if I was to ask you to make a list in answer to the following question, who are you? What are some of the responses that you would give? Well, you might say, first of all, well, I'm a physical human. I'm a human being with a body. You might say, well, I'm a man, I'm a woman. You might say, I'm a child, I'm a teenager, I'm an adult, I'm a senior. You might say, I'm whatever your profession is. You might say, I'm a lawyer, I'm a doctor, I'm a ditch digger, I'm a sanitary engineer, I'm a cook. You might identify yourself as a son or a daughter or a father or a mother. You might call yourself a Catholic, a Muslim, an atheist. You might say, well, I'm white, I'm black, I'm Hispanic, whatever, Asian. You could call yourself a Canadian, an American, a Mexican, whatever your nationality is. In other words, when I ask you to give me a list of how you would define yourself, depending on the circumstances and the context, you're going to tell me about all the ways in which you have invested yourself into a particular identity. And each one of these identities could even be considered separate selves, sub-personalities within the one separated self that you call yourself. And even just as a separated self as a human can have conflicts and various kinds of interactions with other separated selves, within even one human being, we can have these various sub-personalities in conflict with each other. So it even goes that far down. Now, we've recently had the examples of the separated self when it comes to our national identity on the world stage or on the North American stage. Just a couple of days ago, the National Hockey League had the gold medal game for the Four Nations series that involved Canada, the US, Sweden, and Finland, and they held this tournament in Montreal and then in Boston. Any fan of the National Hockey League, a National Hockey League team, of course, many of them are very passionate. You can see when the games are on, all the people wearing the jerseys of their favorite players, of their favorite team. Some of them, even paint all their faces and have weird hats and things like that, all as a way of showing that they identify with that particular team. And especially during the playoffs, these games and the crowds, the atmosphere is totally electric. Nothing like football, as they call it over in Europe, but our version of it for sure. But as soon as this tournament came along and these players were divided up into their country of origins, it went to a whole new level. And the fans went to a whole new level with this whole thing. Why? Because their national identity was at stake. And so all of these ways that we identify ourselves and we separate ourselves from everybody else are the ways that the ego keeps us believing that we are separate not only from everyone else, but from God. But it's all part of the illusion, right? And those are the ways that we have to detach ourselves, detach our investments in these various sub-personalities, and reattach our investment into the truth of who we really are and our identity as gods. The purpose of our spiritual journey, then, is to remember that the separate self is not our true identity. It's a complete illusion, I forget who said this, but albeit a very persistent illusion, right? And of course, none of our parents, guardians, teachers, government, they don't talk about this. Many of them know it at the highest levels of governments and things like that. I can assure you they know this, but they don't want us to know this, right? Because then we would take back our sense of power and our true identity. They want us to be invested in things like hockey teams and whether reality TV shows about people falling in love. They want all that. That's where they want our focus to be, right? We're very brainwashed into continuing to believe in this illusion and invest in it. Our true identity is an undivided soul united with God. The first time I ever heard this was in 1986 when I attended some videos that were being shown at an esoteric philosophy center where Ramtha, channeled entity through J.Z. Knight, was very blasphemously and very forcefully telling us that we were God and that there was no difference between us and God. And I believed it right away, and I still believe it. As I was saying, all that needs to happen is that we need to release our beliefs that we are separate from God. That's all it is. It's a belief. The I that you think that you are is just a belief. The ego is just a belief. When we stop feeding it with our investment of energy into all these different ways that we think that we are and that we're separate, when we stop feeding the illusion that you are separate from me, and we start seeing each other as one, that takes practice and it takes time, but it also takes releasing old beliefs. And when we do, the truth, we start to have what Course in Miracles call true vision instead of the ego's perception of things. In the introduction to A Course in Miracles, there's 2 paragraphs, and the second paragraph reads as follows. I repeat this to myself, I can't tell you how many times, almost daily. Nothing real can be threatened. Nothing unreal exists. Herein lies the peace of God. That says it all. That sums the entire Course in Miracles up. What does that mean? Nothing real can be threatened. Well, the only thing that's real is God. God cannot be threatened. You are God. You cannot be threatened. You will live forever as one with God. The second sentence says, nothing unreal exists. Anything that is a part of the illusion, anything that is temporary, anything that dies is not real. So it doesn't exist. Your body is not real. So it doesn't exist. Herein lies the peace of God is the third one. Imagine yourself being able to detach yourself from all of these identities that you believe that you are, the whole belief that you are a separated self. What would your experience be like? Imagine if you knew that the financial system is not what it is, and that the ups and downs within it had nothing to do with you, and that you could remain at peace no matter what happened. Imagine if you had a home in Pacific Palisades and you held this perspective and you knew that your house was just a projection of your consciousness, one that you certainly experience and can enjoy, and imagine that if it's destroyed, you know that you can be at peace regardless. The human part of you will naturally want to grieve, but the larger part of you can know the truth and ultimately come to a space of peace much faster. That's why we want to take this journey of remembering the truth of who we are. To wrap up then, the self is a concept, it's a false belief, and we still are and always have been at one with God. And when we remember our oneness, we begin to shift our perception and awaken to the reality of who we truly are, and we have true vision and we see how things really are. We are already one with God, and that's where our true peace lies. As I've done in the previous video, I'm asking you to submit your questions on non-duality, because the last video that I'm going to do in this series, maybe 3 or 4 videos from now, is going to be where I answer all your questions. So if you have one, please submit it to the email address in the description box below. In the next video, I'm going to talk about misconceptions, mispractices, and blind spots that we may have about non-duality and about how we are living it and experiencing it. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you come back next week. Bye for now.